हेलो एवरीवन, माय नेम इज वासु और आज हम स्टार्ट करने वाले हैं कंक्लूजन, प्रेमिस एंड अजम्पशंस इन क्रिटिकल रीजनिंग। तो सबसे पहले, हाँ, सबसे पहले माय नेम इज वासु। मैंने आई वाज एन एलेट रैंक 50 एंड क्लैट रैंक 205 एंड आई एम फ्रॉम एनएलयू दिल्ली। तो सबसे पहले अगर हम क्रिटिकल रीजनिंग की बात करें तो क्रिटिकल रीजनिंग हैज इसके प्राइमरी जो कॉन्सेप्ट होते हैं वो है प्रेमिस, कंक्लूजन एंड अजम्पशन। इसके साथ इन्फरेंस भी होता है जो कि हमारा इस वीडियो में कवर्ड नहीं है। सो प्राइमरीली अगर हम कोई भी सेंटेंस देखते हैं या फिर हम उस सेंटेंस को आर्ग्यूमेंट भी बोल सकते हैं, तो उसके ये तीन कंपोनेंट ही होते हैं। ठीक है, तो इसका क्या मतलब है, एक एग्जांपल लेकर चलते हैं। पर्सन ए जो है वो बोलते हैं कि सचिन तेंदुलकर इज द बेस्ट बैट्समैन दैट इंडिया हैज एवर हैड बिकॉज ही हैज द मोस्ट नंबर ऑफ सेंचुरीज। और पर्सन बी जो है वो बोलते हैं दैट नो, वीरेंद्र सहवाग इज द बेस्ट बैट्समैन दैट इंडिया हैज एवर had because he had an the most तो ये दो एग्जाम्पल लेकर चलते हैं। पर्सन ए ने बोला दैट सचिन तेंदुलकर इज द बेस्ट बैट्समैन दैट इंडिया हैज एवर हैड बिकॉज ही हैज द मोस्ट नंबर ऑफ सेंचुरीज। और पर्सन बी बोलता है कि नहीं, वीरेंद्र सहवाग इज द बेस्ट बैट्समैन दैट इंडिया हैज एवर हैड बिकॉज ही हैज द हाईएस्ट स्ट्राइक रेट। तो अब हम देखते हैं कि हमने क्या किस आज से स्टार्ट करी थी कि एवरी सेंटेंस और आर्ग्यूमेंट will always have one conclusion and one premise. तो सबसे पहले what is a conclusion? Conclusion is the result or the overall argument or the purpose of the entire sentence. That is, आप सामने वाले को क्या समझाना चाहते हो? What is your argument? So, person A, what does person A want to convince person B of? person B wants to convince B that Sachin Tendulkar is the best batsman that India has ever had. So this becomes his conclusion. Similarly, person B का क्या conclusion है? That Virender Sehwag is the best batsman that India has ever had. ये तो हो गया हमारा conclusion. Now, what is the premise? The premise is the reason or evidence, or you can also call it proof. So, what is the proof that person A gives to reach his conclusion? That Sachin Tendulkar has the most number of centuries. So, this becomes his premise. So, the premise is the base or the reason or the evidence on which you have based your conclusion. The conclusion stands on the premise. तो ये premise अगर ना होता या अगर ये premise झूठा साबित हो जाए, अगर मैं बोल दूं कि सचिन तेंदुलकर तो मोस्ट नंबर ऑफ सेंचुरीज है ही नहीं, तो this conclusion will also fall. ठीक है? Similarly, person B का क्या premise है? That Virender Sehwag has the highest strike rate. That is the premise. Now, what is an assumption? An assumption, fundamentally, always, an assumption is unstated. That is, you will not find the assumption in the sentence itself. Why? Because assumption is the bridge that connects your premise and conclusion. इसका क्या मतलब है? इसका मतलब यह है that the assumption shows the relationship between your evidence or your premise and your conclusion. क्या मतलब? अगर my argument is that Sachin Tendulkar is the best batsman that India has ever had, and my reason for that is that he has had the most number of centuries, then what is the assumption that I am making? I am making the assumption कि जिस बैट्समैन ने सबसे ज्यादा सेंचुरीज मारी हैं वो बेस्ट कहलाएगा. So the criteria that I am assuming for determining the best batsman that India has ever had, that is where my assumption lies. So my assumption is that the number of centuries determines who the best batsman is. And similarly, for person B, the assumption is that the strike rate determines who the best batsman is. So the strike rate determines who the best अब अगर हमने यही कॉन्सेप्ट यूज करके क्रिटिकल रीजनिंग के क्वेश्चंस बनते हैं, सच एज स्ट्रेंथनिंग एंड वीकनिंग द आर्ग्यूमेंट. अगर मैं आपको बोलूं कि आपको इस आर्ग्यूमेंट को वीकन करना है तो हम क्या कर सकते हैं? first step is to weaken the premise. It is to say that no, boss, Sachin Tendulkar is not the batsman with the most number of centuries. And what can be the argument? You can say something like Virat Kohli has more centuries in one particular format. So that is to say कि आप इसका premise को factually inaccurate बोल रहे हो. आप बोल रहे हो कि तुमने जो premise दिया है, that premise itself is not true. That is the first way of doing it. Similarly, you can say the same thing for person B's argument. Whereas another way of doing this is if you break down the assumption. If you say that this assumption that you have made, that the best batsman is the one with the most number of centuries, that is an incorrect assumption to make. Why? Because let's say Sachin Tendulkar के पास ज्यादा centuries जरूर हैं, but let's say he scored them at a strike rate of 50. So this is where both these persons are differing in their opinions. Because for person B, the higher strike rate determines who the best batsman is, whereas for person A, the number of centuries determine that. Let's say a person C comes and says that no, boss, this is not the criteria for determining the best batsman. It is rather the number of runs they score or the average that they have in their cricketing careers. So if you look at the average, maybe a third person like Rahul Dravid, maybe they will be considered the best batsman. So if you are asked to weaken an argument, you can always attack the assumption or you can attack the premise. Similarly, if you are asked to strengthen an argument, your job is to strengthen the premise or the assumption. That is to say, you can say that yes, there is proof that Sachin Tendulkar does indeed have the most number of centuries. So that confirms the premise. Or another way of doing it is if you can strengthen the assumption, if you can say that for some reason, the correct criteria to determine who the best batsman should be is this criteria. And that strengthens person A's argument as opposed to person B's argument. क्योंकि इन दोनों के difference of opinion कहां था? इनका difference of opinion था इनकी assumption में. Because the criteria that they used was different. ठीक है? So, this is an introduction to conclusion, premise and assumption. एक और चीज का जो हमें ध्यान देना है is that there is a thing called indicator words. Indicator words for premise and for conclusion. इसका क्या मतलब है? तो विदाउट थिंकिंग ऑफ एनीथिंग हमें अगर एक वर्ड दिख जाए विच इज बिकॉज, तो हम ये क्लियरली सोच सकते हैं दैट वॉट एवर फॉलोज दिस वर्ड हैज टू बी द प्रेमिस. व्हाई? बिकॉज विल ऑलवेज टेल यू द प्रूफ ऑफ समथिंग. X happened because of Y, or X is correct because Y fact is true. So, for premise, words such as because, since, due to, or for this reason, etc. Similarly, words like thus, therefore, hence, resultantly, or as a result, all these are indicator words for you to see that whatever follows after this, or grammatically whatever follows along with that, that will be the conclusion. So अगर हमें इस सेंटेंस को उस फॉर्म में लिखना हो, सो वी कैन से दैट Sachin Tendulkar has the most number of centuries. Therefore, he is the best batsman that India has ever had. उसमें हम क्या करते हैं, हमें therefore से पता चलता that okay, this is the main argument, whereas what follows is the reason behind it, and this would have been the premise. So that is just another way of writing the same sentence and writing the same argument. But these indicator words and related words will tell you how to identify a conclusion or a premise. However, for an assumption, you will always have to think beyond the sentence and ask yourself that what connects the premise and the conclusion. Lastly, for assumption, a good test to determine the assumption is assumption negation. That is, अगर आपने एक assumption को negate कर दिया और उस negation की वजह से, negation मतलब to nullify. If you nullify an assumption and after that nullification the argument itself falls, then that means that the assumption was correct. तो हमारे एग्जाम्पल में अगर हम जाएं और मैं यहां बोल दूं that the assumption that strike rate determines who the best batsman is, I say strike rate does not determine who the best batsman is. Or if I say that the number of centuries do not determine who the best batsman is, इस negation से the whole argument falls, the whole conclusion falls that my batsman was the best. And because of that, I know that if the negation of an assumption breaks so once, what is the test for an assumption? The test is that अगर हम इसको negate कर दें और उस negation से the effect is that the whole argument crumbles, then that assumption is a correct assumption. Because without that assumption, the argument cannot stand, because then there is no bridge between the premise and the conclusion. There is no connecting factor between the two, because I have broken that bridge. So that is it for this video. I hope you liked it. And for more such content, please follow the TCR page.